Pay attention to every detail of this story because nothing in it is what it seems. It was a Thursday morning like any other. There were 11 days left until Christmas, and in a quiet suburb of Colorado, a woman was doing exactly what she did every single day. She took her children to school and returned home. Shortly before 8 a.m., she parked in the garage, turned off the car, and opened the door to get out. That day, someone was inside waiting for her. 4.5 hours later, a police officer knocked on the front door of that house and no one answered. He went back to the patrol car, drove around, parked the vehicle near the garage window, looked inside, and saw a woman lying on the floor. She was motionless. The detail that was soon discovered is that for 2 months, that whole family had been living in fear. They had a stalker after them. A man who sent messages saying he was watching, that he knew where they were going, that he would show up soon. The woman had gone to the police, already told the detectives, even hired a private investigator, started carrying a gun, and had installed cameras all over the house. She did everything she could do. And even so, she ended up there on the cold floor of her own garage in the house she had turned into a fortress. The police, during the investigation, already had a name in mind for this stalker. They already knew where he lived, and in no time they were going to knock on this guy's door. But it was only to find out that they had spent 2 months hunting the wrong man. Because the person behind all that terror wasn't as far away as everyone thought. And actually, what this person used that proximity is one of the coldest things you'll hear today. Marcos Campos. And this is the story of a woman who realized she was being hunted, so to speak, did everything she could the right way to protect herself, warned the police, her family, carried a weapon, and yet was killed inside her own home. And this is also the story of a stalker who showed up everywhere all the time, knew every dentist appointment, knew what time her husband got home from work, and sent pictures of him to prove he was watching everyone. And it's also the story of how the most obvious clue in this case, the one the police followed for 2 months, fell apart in a matter of hours because of a sweatshirt bought at a department store. There's a lot going on in this case, right guys? Why do you think the investigation took so long to figure out what was happening? And why do you think the family, even suspecting who the so-called monster observer was, still couldn't protect themselves? Shall we investigate all of this together? So get comfortable and let's get to the facts. The shadow. To understand what happened in that garage, we need to go back about 2 months in the timeline of this case, okay? Back to October 2023. The victim's name was Christy. She was 44 years old, a chemical engineer, and a mother of 3. She was one of those people who seem to be good at everything they do, you know? She had a good mind for math, chemistry, and physics, and at the same time, she was talented in the arts. She grew up working on old cars with her father, spending hours in his garage, taking apart the engine and talking about life. That's where father and daughter understood each other and grew closer. So it's not an exaggeration to say that for her, the garage was a place of affection. Well, on October 2nd, 2023, Christy got a strange message on her phone. It was from a number she didn't recognize, signed by someone named Anthony. The guy said he was going to be in the area and asked if she wanted to meet up with him. She obviously didn't reply. The next day, another message came from the same number. But this time, there was nothing polite about the message. The guy was kind of obscene, aggressive, and even ended by telling her to kill herself so he would stop wasting his time. All right, pretty unusual and bizarre so far, right? The guy, overnight, goes from, let's meet up to go kill yourself. Someone, by the way, who hadn't even properly identified himself up to that point. But Christy suspected who this Anthony might be. That's because Anthony Holland was her ex-boyfriend from the past, back in their school days, right after they finished high school and started college. They were together for a short time, about a year or so. She was about 17 or 18 years old. This was in the 2000s or so, more than 2 decades ago. Christy's father even remembered this guy, Anthony, fondly. He was a polite, friendly guy with good manners. The problem is, according to Christy, this Anthony had never learned to accept no for an answer. That's the link in this chain. In 2002, he showed up out of nowhere, and he showed up again in 2005 and 2010. And other very random moments like that, throughout the 2010s for example, and always a random message there on Facebook. He'd sometimes send strange messages there, saying they were meant for each other. And things like that. In one of those attempts, quote unquote, from this Anthony guy, even Christy herself told him that it was getting kind of creepy, that he should stop. She even ended up deleting her Facebook account, thinking she had gotten rid of the guy for good. And that's when, after years of silence, the messages from 2023 start showing up again, and they're much more intense than anything that had happened before. Christy did the right thing, didn't she? She went to the police in Broomfield and talked to a detective named Andrew Martinez, and the conversation was even recorded. And you can even see her trying to stay calm, repeating to herself that all of this was just to terrorize, to scare her, as if saying that, right? Helped her not to break down emotionally right there, to stop feeling that real fear she was feeling. But look, it didn't stop at the text messages, okay? Things started arriving by email. The email address that sent the threats actually had her ex's last name in it, something like Holland and Kicks. And because of that, the family even started calling the stalker by a kind of creepy nickname, Kickman, for the guy who kicked. And this Kickman kept getting bolder, okay? In one of the messages, a photo arrived. And this photo is really important to the case, okay? It was a picture of Christian's husband Daniel, known as Dan, getting out of the car, right in front of his workplace. A photo taken up close, and the caption that came with the photo, right with the message, had a threatening, provocative tone. It asked if that was her husband. And it was this photo that made Christian go to the police for the first time to talk about what was happening. Because until then, everything was only happening to her. Now the stalker was showing that he was also keeping an eye on her husband. A few days later, another message arrived. A message saying that he had seen her at the dentist and that he would see her soon. The guy knew she had gone to the dentist. He also knew what time her husband got home from the office and had even gotten very close to him. Close enough to take a picture, in fact. For Christian, that could only mean one thing. She was being watched by someone obsessed who was always close by, all the time, everywhere. Total horror movie, right? And here's a detail that seemed at the time like just another layer of horror. Her husband Dan was also being threatened now. He told the detectives that he was devastated, that he couldn't function, quote unquote, properly anymore, right? He was affected, he was struggling. He said he had a total panic attack in a supermarket once someone dropped a can behind him. He freaked out. He said he was doing a terrible job protecting his wife and family. They were a couple literally living inside a nightmare with an invisible watcher stalking them. At this point, Christian's life had changed a lot. She started carrying a gun, like I mentioned, and her father, very worried, lent her one of his guns. She took shooting lessons. She filled the house with security cameras. She told everything to her brothers, to her parents, and even the 3 kids knew there was someone really crazy after their mom and dad. In a conversation with her sister, Christian said a phrase that the family never forgot, and they probably never will, that it was going to be her or him. One of the two would end up dead in this story, and that she was going to do everything so it wouldn't be her. She had even already found the enemy, okay? Tired of waiting, she hired a private investigator on her own. And she found out where Anthony Holland was living. It was in Utah, about 800 kilometers from her house. So she took the information to Detective Martinez. And Martinez made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He didn't go after Holland at that moment. His reasoning was by the book, let's say. He wanted to gather the evidence first, get a warrant, and only then knock on the guy's door to arrest him right away, instead of showing up too early, scaring the guy, and having to leave empty-handed, you know? To get the evidence then, he depended on warrants for the phone and email providers, and those companies took their time, dragged things out, and the process started to drag on. Another link in this chain, that bureaucratic delay. Christian, who was living in a constant state of panic, obviously, every day of waiting felt like an eternity. She even vented to her father, saying she felt like the police had abandoned her, that they weren't acting with enough force. And it was in that atmosphere, 11 days before Christmas, that the wait finally ended. The hunt. Well, we already know how that morning of the 14th went, right? Christian came back after dropping the kids off at school. She pulled into her garage a little after 8 in the morning, and she never walked out of there again. And when Officer John O'Hare found her body there through the garage window around 12:30 p.m., he shouted over the radio that there was a woman down inside a house. The whole investigation already had a suspect. Just one, in Detective Martinez's mind too. At that first moment, the conclusion was kind of obvious. The stalker from Utah, the stalker had carried out his threat. He came, entered the house, and killed Christian. That's what 2 months of very disturbing messages had already been warning about. So this time, the police acted quickly. A few hours after the body was found, agents from Utah surrounded Anthony Holland's house in the city of Eagle Mountain, near Salt Lake City. And this is where the story takes its first turn, because the man who opened that door wasn't who the police were expecting to find. The man who was home alone. He heard banging on the door. He opened it and came face to face with a bunch of police officers. He had no idea what was going on. When they asked if he knew Christian Krug, he immediately said yes. She was actually his first girlfriend. They asked when was the last time he spoke to her. He said it had been a long time. Around 2014 or 2016 in a Facebook message. He said he was missing her. He thought the police were there because of that old message. They were the ones who told him that Christian had just been murdered that morning. The police weren't there to give information. They were there to get the guy. And the question that mattered was pretty simple. Where were you, man? Can you prove it now? And Holland could. Just a few hours earlier, he had bought a sweatshirt at a department store near his house. He had the receipt right there in his pocket. The receipt showed the exact time of the purchase. 12:16 p.m., Christian had been attacked around 8 a.m. over there in Colorado. There's no human being who could kill someone in Colorado at 8 a.m. and be buying a sweatshirt in Utah. That's 800 kilometers, guys. That's the distance at 12:16 p.m. It's physically impossible. I don't know. Maybe if the guy had taken a plane, but that wasn't proven either. Well, given that, there's always a but, right? The sweatshirt wasn't the only thing he had there as an alibi. Holland also showed records from his job proving that he had been in Utah, okay? Every day. He never set foot in Colorado. He never traveled. The stalker's messages had made everyone believe he was lurking around Christian's house. But he was 800 kilometers away from there, working, living his life with no idea that he was the main murder suspect. The police made a call, checked everything. They came back and said he was cleared. Anthony Holland, the supposed kickman, the monster behind 2 months of terror, the man the whole family feared, was ruled out, and for good, in a matter of hours. And that left the investigation at a dead end with nowhere to go because the only suspect they had just vanished. If it wasn't the supposed stalker, then who the hell went into that garage to kill Christian? The address from the messages? While all of this was happening over in Utah, on the other side, in Colorado, Christian's husband was at the police station. He had rushed home from work after hearing about his wife's death. He was devastated. There was a victim support professional there, one of those people trained to comfort relatives, you know, in a state of shock. He stayed right by his side the whole time. She later said that the man was crying a lot, curled up there, and that he had only one concern at that moment. He wanted to tell his children what had happened to their mother. He didn't want anyone else to give them that news. In his statement, the husband said it had been an absolutely normal morning until then. He said mornings at their house were pure routine. The kids would go to and from school. That Christian seemed fine, you know, when he left for work. He said he received a message when he was already driving to work and got a message from Christian asking if he could pick up the kids from school later. He replied asking what time, and that she never replied after that. And that was, according to him, what made him really worried. It made him call the police to request a welfare check. When they asked his theory about what had happened, he laid out an entire scenario. Someone must have knocked on the door. Maybe Christian went out to get a package, and the person came in. And Christian was strong. She was a fighter. She would have fought back. It was a devastated man trying to make sense of his own tragedy. But on the other side of the table, the investigation had nothing, right? After all, the stalker wasn't who they thought he was. That's when the man who may have been the most important piece in this whole case came in. Digital forensic expert from the Broomfield Police, named Randy Pillock. Here, this might be the most important part, right? Because it was what made the case move forward. The moment when a stalking case turns into a homicide case. Kind of all the bureaucratic roadblocks suddenly have to give way, and then the expert Pillock, who before depended on a lot of things, right? Warrants, etc. Now he was able to request information urgently, and that's exactly what he did. 4 or 5 hours after the body was found, he was already poring over those messages that had terrified Christian for 2 months. And this expert found something that changed everything, okay? The harassment messages had come from 2 different accounts, but both had been sent from the same place, the same internet address, right? The same IP. And that address wasn't just anywhere, okay? It was at a state public health agency in Colorado, in Glendale. And now, whoever guesses who worked at that place gets a treat. That's right. Christian's husband worked there. The messages that threatened Christian, the messages that threatened Dan himself, had been written and sent using his office's internet network. And who witnessed all of this, right? He says that in the investigation room at that moment, it seemed like the room went completely silent when the expert shared that information, because it dawned on everyone at the same time. The stalker they had been hunting for 2 months might have been sitting right there in front of everyone, pretending to be one of the victims. And if he was the stalker sending the messages, why not think he could also be the killer? Because there's always more, right? So it has to be investigated. The detectives went back to the room and confronted the husband with this new information. They said they had already talked to Anthony Holland over in Utah and that there was no chance he could have been in the city that day. He wasn't the killer. And then the husband's attitude changed. He leaned back on the couch, crossed his arms, kind of closed himself off, you know? Body language. He said with an oddly calm tone that if it wasn't Holland, then who could it have been? The grieving husband said he was terrified to take his children back home, afraid the killer was still on the loose. The detectives who were watching his every move noticed, however, that something was missing in that man, you know? Suddenly, there was a lack of a more natural reaction of real despair, despite the news that his wife's killer was still on the loose. He was so restrained, so stiff. They then asked to collect physical evidence from him right there and sent him away because they still didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. On his way out, he kept insisting that the real killer was still at large and even made an appeal. That they should catch the culprit, that he didn't care if they arrested or killed the guy, but that please they should keep looking and not assume it was him. The killer had taken his children's mother away from them right before Christmas. And he was very angry about that and asked the police to keep searching, not to get stuck on him as if he were the most obvious suspect now. While he was saying that, the machine was already working against him, and every new thing that came up just kept making things worse. The autopsy confirmed the brutality of what had happened in that garage. Crystal was attacked from behind, struck several times on the head with a blunt object, with 2 to 3 fractures in her skull. And then, with her already down and defenseless, he turned her onto her back and stabbed her right in the heart. For the prosecution, that last stab was completely unnecessary to kill her. It was pure rage, pure control. It was the desire to control her until the very last second. The family, who until then was just a broken family, started to tell the truth about the marriage. Because on the outside, that couple there, married for 16 years, 3 children, everything looked very beautiful in that quiet suburb. But on the inside, Crystal had been sleeping on the couch. They were already sleeping separately. The husband had a very explosive temper. His face, they say, would even turn red when he felt he was losing control. And Crystal's sister clearly remembered having seen that face before. The couple had even agreed to leave, take a walk, get some distance to cool off when things got heated, you know? And in the last few months, Crystal had made the decision that would change everything in the most normal way possible, right? She wanted a divorce. She didn't want that marriage anymore. And the digital expert, while everything was being investigated, you know, the details, the family's statements, he was there digging up more digital footprints. On Crystal's cell phone, he found those messages from the morning of the crime, okay? Including the one her husband swore he received while he was driving to work, about picking up the kids from school, remember? That's right. But those messages had been scheduled. Crystal's cell phone had a system that allowed you to schedule a message to be sent later. And then the expert Pilak had no doubt that the person who scheduled those messages was the husband Dan. He scheduled them before leaving the house. And he could only have done that for a logical reason, right? Because Crystal was dead. And he needed to create the illusion that she was still alive and texting him normally at the time the forensic team would estimate her time of death. It was like an alibi written with the victim's own finger in quotes. Look at how morbid this is. Forensics showed that Crystal's phone wasn't actually used after about 8:22 in the morning. Her messages, in quotes, came in after that. They were ghost messages, and it was exactly one of those scheduled messages that he received there, saying she was on her way to work, right? He got to the office around 9:27. Later, he sent texts and made calls to Crystal during lunch, but got no response. And only then did he call the police, acting like a very worried husband. And there's more, okay? Remember that photo of him leaving work that the stalkers sent to scare Crystal? Yeah. The expert found out that the phone that took that photo was in selfie mode with a timer. No one took a picture of Dan from a distance hiding. It was him himself. He put the phone somewhere, set the timer, and pretended he was being photographed. Then he sent it to his wife, pretending to be a stalker to reinforce that the two of them were being watched. He staged his own stalking. And when the detectives went after the security cameras that Crystal had installed in the house, the hope was to find the whole crime recorded, right? They actually found out that 3 of those cameras had been turned off, and the doorbell camera, in fact, had been covered with a piece of masking tape. That tape, they later found out, came from their own kitchen, from their kitchen drawer. There was only 1 camera left working near the garage. Dan must have just forgotten. It was just an oversight, you know? The house's security system was deactivated at 8 and 8:15 in the morning using Crystal's cell phone. And maybe the coldest part of all this, on the husband's cell phone, the expert found a Google search. Actually, searches made the day before the murder. Things like what happens when someone is knocked out, if people really pass out when they get hit on the head, and how hard you have to hit someone's head to make them unconscious. He searched how to hit someone on the head. He wanted to hit his wife on the head. That was the day before, man. It's really crazy, isn't it? So all that was left was to tie everything together, right? And actually, the whole thing practically came together on its own, okay? The guy also sent some threats using disposable phones, and they had been bought with a gift card registered in his name. Several pieces of evidence that he himself had created pointing back to him. And those disposable phones, by the way, were always being tracked, right? When they started investigating this digital part, he always showed up in the same places as Dan's personal cell phone. Wherever Dan was, Kickman was there too. 2 days after the murder, the police already had enough. They followed the husband with a fleet of about 8 cars to the supermarket, waited for him to park, confirmed he was alone in the car, and closed in on him in the parking lot. They took him out of the vehicle and told him he was being arrested for his wife's murder. And Detective Martinez, the one who had believed the story about the Utah stalker for 2 months, asked the man a single question. Remember that on the day of her death, the husband had begged to be the one to tell the children that their mother had been murdered? Then, Martinez looked him in the face and asked if he also wanted to be the one to tell the children that their mother's killer was their own father. Dan didn't say anything, asked to speak to his lawyer, and looked away. The detective closed the door and they went to the police station, or rather to jail, right? And damn, what a punch in the gut, isn't it? That move of the guy putting pressure on the killer like that. The jury. The trial began in April 2025, more than a year after the crime. The prosecution, led by prosecutors, painted a picture for the jury that had nothing to do with the fragile, supposedly stalked husband from the early days. The prosecution's theory was as follows. The marriage was ending, Christian wanted to leave, and the husband couldn't accept losing control over her. So he invented a stalker. That whole campaign of terror, the messages, the emails, the photo, the surveillance, was all in the beginning a way to deceive and push Christian back into his arms. The idea was to make her feel very afraid, in constant danger, so she would start to see her husband as a protector, a hero, someone who could defend her and keep her away from that danger. But it didn't work. The terror didn't bring Christian back. On the contrary, she remained determined to separate. And according to the prosecution, that's when things changed from if I scare you, you'll stay with me, to if you're not going to stay, then you won't be with anyone else either. There's a detail here, okay? In the last days of her life, Christian started to suspect her husband. According to Dan's own statement, she even looked him in the face and said she couldn't rule out the possibility that he was the stalker. Can you believe that? And he denied it at the time, of course. The clock was ticking on the separation and his sick desperation was mounting. He was about to lose his wife one way or another. And he was also about to be exposed as the man behind that wicked plan to scare his wife and the whole family. That's why he waited for her in the garage that morning, determined to kill her. The defense didn't try to deny what happened, okay? What the lawyer did was attack the holes in the investigation, and it's even fair to say that there really were holes there, okay? The object used to hit Christian's head was never found. The knife used was also not recovered. The lawyer insisted on that. And also that Christian's cell phone hadn't been tested, not tested for fingerprints or DNA, and that you can't be sure about something they didn't even bother to look for. He pointed out that the DNA test done on the victim's chest also didn't find the husband's genetic material, and that there was no blood in the car. For the defense, there was a lack of physical evidence linking that man's hands to his wife's body. The jury heard both sides for more than 2 weeks. They deliberated for about a day and a half, and they came back with the word that was repeated 4 times: guilty. First-degree murder, stalking with extreme emotional distress, stalking with threat and repeated communication, and identity theft. Because he had actually stolen the identity of that guy from Utah who had dated Christian to fantasize about all of this. The judge imposed the sentence that this type of conviction carries in Colorado: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And on top of that, another 9.5 years were added for the charges of stalking and fraud. And then you think that, convicted with all that evidence, all the digital proof stacked against him, the man would finally drop the mask. He didn't. In the days following his conviction, right? He kept making video calls from prison to his own family, swearing that the jury had been, I don't know, deceived, that they had made a mistake, that they had never presented any real concrete evidence, and that the real killer was still out there. He even said that his children needed to leave Colorado because they could be the next targets. He kept lying to the same family he had already deceived for months, until his own brother, during one of those calls, was honest. He said that the family's support was running out, that no matter how much everyone wanted to believe him, too many things had come to light, and that some of it was impossible to explain or ignore, no matter how creative he tried to be. And in the face of all that, there's a lingering question in this case, and it's a pretty uncomfortable one. The police knew the name of the supposed stalker, didn't they? They knew the address in Utah. Christian handed everything over easily, thanks to a private investigator she paid for herself. And the state detective chose to wait to gather evidence, to do things the right way, in quotes, so they wouldn't mess up the case when it was time to arrest the guy. But the man in Utah was innocent, as we saw. And this turn of events should have happened much earlier. Maybe that could have saved Christian's life. The detective who handled the case says he still carries that with him today, that the case haunts him. If he could go back in time, he would do things differently. 11 days before Christmas. In the couple's garage, the husband hid, waiting for his wife to come back and take their children to school, to take her life. It takes a cold, wicked heart. A lot of wickedness. Wow, poor kids, right? And poor Christian, who had spent his whole life hours and hours in a garage, next to his father, among the cars they loved, that they adored. He lost his life in a garage. What a tragic irony, isn't it? And before I finish, there's another detail about this cold husband, okay, that I haven't told yet. An ex-girlfriend of his testified at the trial, and she said he had already done the same thing to her decades ago. He created several fake identities to harass her. That was after they broke up, and the police said the pattern was the same as in Christian's case. But in the case of this ex-girlfriend, he was never charged. This shows he had a method, right? Really strange. I want to know your thoughts. Tell me here. Check your channel subscription and become a member if you can. It really helps. Don't forget to like. Thanks for your company. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.